think the left really should, and I think there are some people within the movement who are doing it, but we need to get a much bigger audience for this. Be able to tell these stories that, like, if you want to say that you're a sixth, generation Texan and you're worried about the direction that things are going in, you need to return to your roots. And be an anti-capitalist, anti-property, anti-police, activist, because those are your people, not these kind of rich assholes. Because Texas has always had influx of rich people trying to take shit away from folks.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
Greetings, Sublation viewers and hopefully future readers. My name is Djene Bajalan, in for Doug Lane today, and I am talking with David Griscom, who is a podcaster. He is involved in the Left Reckoning podcast. He has a long history in the left media sphere, working with Michael Brooks in the past on TMBS, and he's also a local activist in his home state of Texas. Welcome to Sublation Media.
Man, I'm really honored to be here, Gene.
It is a pleasure to have you here, and I was really looking forward to talking to you today so that we could talk about the left in, let's say, the parts of the country which are often described as flyover country. Both you and I are residents of Midwestern or Western states. And of course, many people have, let's say, interesting preconceptions of what those places are like. Both in the United States, in the kind of metropolitan centers, there's often a negative point of view from people who are left liberal or even leftists about what the Midwest is like, and it's inherently sort of reactionary nature. And I would say that point of view is not just prevalent amongst Americans, but also people outside of the United States who view the center of the United States as being this land of, socially conservative, pro-capitalist, reactionary. So I wanted to talk to you as a resident of Texas, as someone who's involved in left politics in Texas, about Texas politics today. And then perhaps we can get into some of the history of the left in a place like Texas and in the Midwest more generally, to try and challenge some of the preconceptions that people might have about the Midwest or so-called flyover country. So what I want to start by asking you, David, is what's going on in Texas? There's been a lot of hoo-ha in the news about some of the new socially conservative legislation that's coming out relating to abortion rights, relating to trans rights. There seems to be a big conservative push taking place in the cultural wars. What does this mean? What is the function of these laws? And to what extent are these obscuring fundamental legal changes taking place in the state that are, affecting the economy and that are hurting, let's say, the socially conservative base of the Republican Party in economic terms? Is this a smoke and mirrors? What's the point of it? Why are they attacking women's rights and LGBTQ rights in Texas at the moment? Can you give us some context on that?
Yeah, I mean, first things first, the bills that have been passed regarding trans rights and abortion rights in Texas are truly abhorrent. Not only are they, putting restrictions and attack people's lives, the entire setup of the way that these are enforced is quite frightening. So the abortion bill is not just, a limit onto the, you have to get get an abortion in a very, very short time. But they also have provisions in there that sort of encourage people in the state to tattle on their neighbors. the abortion law has a bounty,
Mhm.
which is quite frightening, and they're written in a way that is in a quite cynically genius way to try to prevent legal challenges against them, because the government itself, at least regarding the abortion bill, is not the first actor, right? It's private people bringing suit against others to sort of enforce these mechanisms. So it's more difficult, for example, for the federal government, to sue the attorney general. That doesn't mean, by the way, the excuse that the federal government can't get involved is just that it's an excuse. But they're sort of set up in a way, after learning after years and years and years, the right wing here, about ways to try to avoid or make it more difficult for federal involvement, and in challenging these just clearly unconstitutional laws. I mean, there's the kind of general sense, frankly, with these socially conservative, movements and bills that have gone through, that is just like, okay, well, that's the base of the Republican Party. But what's notable, particularly about the abortion bill, is that it is polling shows that it's very unpopular. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily unpopular enough for there to be a popular uprising in the sense of people who typically vote GOP. But it actually does not have as much support as some people might imagine it does locally, because it's just egregious. Like abortion in particular has become such a culture war issue, even though it's very material. That I would say that while most people, most GOP voters in Texas probably don't have the most enlightened views about whether, about abortion in general. Most people sort of recognize that, deputizing everyday citizens to sort of harass their neighbors is not something that they want.
Mhm.
So, I think that there's some room there to challenge it. Is it strong enough on its own without serious organizing and a serious opposition to break it? I would have some doubts there. Why is that happening, though? I think is brings us into a much more interesting bit of Texas politics and understanding the kind of ruling coalition here. Um, Primarily, it's the evangelical community, which the GOP courted primarily in the '80s. And
Mhm.
people forget that Texas was a democratically run state for most of its history post Civil War. Um, and this was a project that was put into place mainly by Karl Rove, to turn Texas into a red bastion, and he was the one who really developed the evangelical, bringing in the evangelical Christian community into the GOP voting base. And that group of people certainly wants these kind of hyper conservative reactionary bills. Um, but this is one of those things where the GOP has been so dominant now for so long that they actually have to start giving some meat to that base, and it's frightening. And the reason that's happening basically is because of the lack of serious opposition. Now that the government at this point is pretty much completely run by the Republican Party. We haven't had statewide elected Democratic officials here. I think it's something like 22 years, 24 years. Um, so, like, this is one of those things where that base is sort of demanding, like, y'all have been in power for so long, you need to start delivering on the things that you say you want to do.
So you would say, at least amongst a certain element of the Republican establishment, they're not particularly ideologically wedded to these socially conservative laws, but the direction of Texas politics is, in a sense, forcing their hand. Where so long as you keep this issue alive, it can be a useful electoral strategy. But at some point, when you're successful, there's an expectation that they will deliver, and if they don't deliver, there's a certain cost to that, and they're beginning to realize that cost.
There are plenty of true believers in the Republican Party here in all of this kind of stuff, but you have to understand, like, the context here. Dan Crenshaw, right? The new darling of the right wing, was challenged, by the extreme right. Greg Abbott, again, won his primary handedly, but he was being challenged from the right. The challenges that I think most of the people in power are sweating are this kind of, very, very fervently right wing, socially reactionary, constituency in Texas, those are the ones who they're the most worried about having to keep in line. And I think Trump in particular really broke some of the more traditional like power centers here and showed people that like you don't control your voters. And like, so they felt the need to really show up for that very, very passionate base of voters. You have to remember that Texas has very, very low voter turnout too. So when we're talking about this, when I talk about the general population of Texas, how they feel, that might be very different from the average voter in Texas, right? Those are two very, very different groups, because a lot of people have checked out of politics here because it's one of those things that feels futile for a lot of people to show up and vote because they know what they're going to get on the other end. I wanted to also, just because I think the structure is really important, maybe to help people understand this picture, help people also understand that not only is the government here controlled by the GOP, but what particularly the executive branch has been able to develop over the past 2 decades has been quite striking. So Texas is what's called a weak governor state. That goes all the way back to the founding documents of the country. The idea was that you did not want to have a strong centralized government in the state. You want the legislature, the ledge, to have the majority of power. And started a little bit with Bush, but Rick Perry really changed that dynamic because power is very decentralized in the executive branch. There's a lot of different, people who hold powers that would traditionally be held by the governor in other states, who are supposedly technically independent, but they've basically created kind of like clientelist system here, where all the people in power are extremely loyal. They were extremely loyal to Rick Perry. He really broke this mold of the weak governor model. And then Abbott inherited it and then deepened it. Abbott, too, has like really increased the power of the executive branch through COVID, which is an interesting dynamic here, where obviously he was somebody who's very against like the restrictions and all of that kind of stuff, but he
That's
used
what I was
his,
gonna. That's what I was gonna
Mhm.
ask. A lot
Yeah.
of conservative critiques of the COVID state are that this is a grab for power. This is
Hmm.
undemocratic. But I think one of the fascinating things about COVID is that you can use COVID in both ways to appropriate power. You can use COVID as a real emergency to appropriate power, or you can say COVID is a fiction that's being made up by a liberal elite in a distant imperial capital, and I'm going to use that to appropriate power. So, could you expand a little bit on the dynamic in Texas towards centralization of power and the way COVID
Hmm.
played into it in terms of the way the crisis was utilized in a kind of atypical way?
So Abbott declared a state of emergency at the beginning of the pandemic, and he used that power. Very early on, he put in some kind of basic restrictions, like most other places, but that was extremely unpopular. And he then used those emergency powers as the pandemic started to develop in other places in different ways, the way that cities and local governments were sort of dealing with it. He used that power to override and overrule all other local authorities. So you have to remember the thing about a thing about Texas too is that, you know, while the state trends one way, so for statewide office, the vast majority of people live in cities like Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, um, where the local politics actually do trend more democratic. So those cities trying to put in basic kind of things like mask mandates and shut down non-essential businesses at the very beginning. And Abbott basically used the emergency powers to completely overrule the authority of those localities, and has used it in very, very interesting ways to basically be able to push back the vast majority of legislation that's coming out of cities. So like one of the big fights that you have in Texas is, because there is such a loss of power on the state level, cities have been trying to do things like mandate paid sick leave, mandate higher minimum wage and things like that. And Abbott, not always successfully, has really used his powers to try to make that as difficult as possible for localities to be able to make decisions for themselves, right? So the irony, of course, and irony only gets you so far, is that these small government Republicans basically at every step of the way wage war on the smallest on the smallest form of government in the state
And
of
this
Texas.
is not a new tendency. As far as I
Hmm.
understand, for example, with the issue of fracking, the ability of localities to refuse to have fracking in their in their jurisdiction, that was also taken away from localities. So what we're basically seeing is, would you say, a cynical deployment of small government arguments in order to concentrate power at the level which is most amenable to
Hmm.
Republican control. So, for example, if the federal government was that level that they could guarantee their control on, they would focus power there. But because Republican control of the federal government is, can be tenuous, they can lose power. Maintaining control on an effective one-party state or a dominant party state, and concentrating power at that level is the strategy that they're pursuing. And
Hmm.
the small government rhetoric is merely a convenient fiction in order to justify that to a base that may actually be sincerely committed to small government, whatever that means to them.
I mean, I think that's exactly the case as to how it's been developing. Again, particularly over the past 2 decades, and it really has accelerated over the past 4 years. And I think that it's important for people to recognize that, particularly post 2020. And that gets us a little bit to the Democratic Party. But 2020 was supposed to be the year that the Texas legislature flipped to Democratic control. And not only did that not happen, the Republicans actually increased their hold on the ledge. Um, some things too is you have to understand is that the way that the legislature set up here, they have one of the shortest legislative seasons, I believe, in the country. So it's only a matter of weeks, frankly, where bills are actually able to um, be introduced and brought into law. Now, the governor can call back a special session, and Abbott has done that for time to time. But a lot of things fall through the cracks. Particularly when it comes to dealing with weatherizing the grid in Texas after the devastating storm. That has been, frankly, a complete disaster from the state government level. And like obviously, like the Republicans have an ideological goal with how they want to see the grid and that system function. But also, like a lot of things that are just the responsibility of government, regardless if it's Republican or Democrat, fall through the cracks. I believe in 2020. After that legislative session there, like they weren't able to re-up the requirements for plumbers.
Hmm.
The state has to approve them, and basically there was a short period of time in Texas where basically anybody could show up and say that they're approved because there was no like statewide approval system for these things. So like a lot of things fall through the cracks, but that also only increases the argument for people like Abbott and people in these kind of executive positions to say, well, we need to use our authority here to shore up or deal with these kind of problems, which only continues to concentrate power in an elected office that, just because of the way that the political map is here, is probably one of the most immune to kind of democratic, control or
Hmm.
checks.
So I kind of wanted to circle back to something before we get onto the
Hmm.
question of the Democrats. Is that, we've talked about abortion rights. We didn't really touch on trans rights, but there's also obviously a big issue about legislation pertaining to transgender children.
Hmm.
And then, of course, we mentioned COVID. Now, these issues are all, there are elements of the left, I would say, not everybody on the left. There are elements of the left who would dismiss these issues as being culture war issues that are not particularly important. And then, of course, there are elements who would perhaps fetishize these issues as well.
Mm.
How do you see the left in terms of the way that however we define the left, let's say the social democratic left, or even the revolutionary left, or people who have a concrete class analysis and want to see some form of class-based politics, whether within the electoral system or whether outside the electoral system, how do you see, as someone in Texas, that they should approach these questions? And how would you approach them differently from the way that mainstream liberals and Democrats approach these questions? And perhaps that can bridge us on to talking a little bit about liberalism and the Democrats in Texas.
I mean, all three of particularly abortion and trans rights are an extension of, one, undoubtedly the war against women and the war against trans people in these communities, but they're also, and I would argue, a part of the hammer of class war, right? The people who struggle the most, for example, with this abortion ban are poor working class people. These are people who have limited resources in the first place. There's a lot of really great charities that do abortion work in Texas because it's expensive and it's difficult to get them here. While people in like Houston, they'll just go over the border. They'll just take a flight to another state to be able to get this kind of medical treatment if they needed it past, past the window that's allowed now in the state of Texas. Well, poor people, sort of have to go through, and struggle under like these laws as they're written, right? So there's a part of this. It's like there's laws for normal people, working people in this state, and there's laws for the wealthy. The trans is another part of, again, shoring up a kind of socially conservative base. But as I was saying earlier, it's also waging war on your neighbors, right? And one of the big parts, I would argue, of the way that the modern day GOP functionally operates here is to kind of foment war within people in this society, right? So if your neighbor is, has a trans child, there is a incentive, and frankly, like they're trying to make it almost seem like your duty to report that to the state of Texas. So that the state of Texas can use child protective services to take people's children away. Now, can you imagine what that does to the social fabric of your community? Can you imagine what that does to kind of neighborly relationships with people? The government of Texas, the current ruling coalition here, has no interest, for example, in really strong communities, thriving in Texas, because that's a threat to their power base. They like a system where we have a low voter turnout. They like a system where they only have to answer to a few folks. And they're not particularly interested in taking care of the vast majority of people in Texas. Look no further than how they've handled this crisis when it comes to the grid here, right? For the most part, there have been, and just briefly, like for people who don't understand, like we have a deregulated electrical grid here in Texas, unless you live in it. Like, so I live in Austin, and we still have, public power, but it operates on a state grid that is deregulated, which means that there are competing electrical firms that are delivering electricity to your homes, right? It's the idea is that like, oh, the market will make electricity cheaper. That has not actually been the case. And as you see, when you compare the amount of money that people pay for electricity in Texas versus other states in the country, it's very up and down, particularly if you live in, a place that has like public power. Like Austin, you're paying actually a little bit less than people who are on this deregulated grid. But beyond that, having all of this kind of competition on the electrical grid has meant that the system is much, much less efficient, and is much more open to these kind of weather shocks that we saw during the winter storm. And why does that system exist? Well, because people make a shitload of money on it.
Right.
Like people make an incredible amount of money. And, one of the great tragedies is after that, the grid failure, people ended up having skyrocketing electric bills because the
I
price for
saw
electricity shot up.
some of the news stories about, it's, because it's, they talk about competition, but really it's all run by monopolies, and they divide up the market between themselves, and it's and then of course when a crisis hits, they gouge people for money and blame it on the market.
And no, exactly. And that's the other thing too, is it's always like some external force, right? That like we can't control. It's like the hand of God is making it this way. When no, it's deliberate human choice. And, this is part of the strategy of the Texas GOP right now, is to create such a state of like social chaos amongst folks that it's really hard to build something else up, right? Because the way that I'm just saying really quick, the way that the GOP tried to, flip the script on, their complete failure to manage the grid was that, oh, it's wind power, right? the wind turbines failed. But it's like, no, it ended up being natural gas. But what does that end up doing when that comes into the public square, when you're talking to your neighbor? They might lean Republican or something like that. They want to wage war on, they want to get worked up about all these stupid wind turbines are killing, wind turbines
But
are killing birds, and they're, and they're inefficient and all this kind of stuff. When in reality, it was a free market system that completely failed. But you can see where, the typical liberal response to that is not to talk about that. They're going to talk about like, no, wind is great and all this kind of stuff, right? And it creates a kind of state of confusion for the vast majority of people here, where it's hard for people to really set themselves straight and start to build political opposition, because everybody doesn't want the power to go out. And you have two competing sides telling both, their people, frankly, a fiction. And the vast majority of the debate, unfortunately, has not been on the kind of things that we need to do, which are democratize power, increase nuclear, and this kind of free market system. It's been like, oh, do you think wind is good, or do you think
or
wind is
bad.
bad, right?
I think this is a very important point, because I do think there are some elements on the left who do get caught up, in this argument and become
Hmm.
functionally conservative because they're reacting against the liberal narrative, which is also a kind of fictional narrative as well. But I think what you're pointing to is really important. These touchstone issues, which
Hmm.
are, some are. That have a material basis, but are not necessarily a purely class-based interest, function as uh, points of political polarization that promote social disintegration and make it, because these are very emotional issues, make it difficult for people to coalesce into a class-based politics, whether that is channeled through the electoral system or outside of the electoral system. If you're fighting with your neighbor over whether you think abortion should be legal or not, it becomes more and more difficult for people to look at where their common interests are, perhaps in terms of
Hmm.
improved working conditions or in terms of Medicare. For example, both people might be like, we really want Medicare, but if you're fighting over abortion, suddenly is abortion going to be covered in a Medicare for all system, or is abortion? It
Hmm.
allows you to be distracted onto these very specific issues, which are important, but become the entire debate. And to a certain degree, and I think what you're hinting at is that liberals, to a certain degree or to a great degree, fall into that trap set by the Republicans. So, for example, with something you mentioned about the power grid, the problem was not so much technology. The problem was the economic system and the organizational basis in which
Hmm.
those resources are distributed. But liberals are responding to Republicans saying it's wind, and they're like, no, wind is amazing. And
Hmm.
suddenly you end up with a polarized debate, which is actually a debate that is not really addressing anything to do with the source of the crisis.
Yeah, and and like, to be fair, I mean, I think a lot of people pointed out natural gas, too, on the liberal side, but it was sort of without the context of, okay, well, the reason that those natural gas pipelines were not weatherized was because these companies understood that this could happen, and they knew that if it did, they would be fine, because they would, one, make record profits, and then their system would operate properly once the freeze was over. And instead of making the upfront investment to make sure that something like that didn't happen, and remember, like, people died. This was a real crisis. Instead of like putting that upfront cost to basically make sure that the lights don't go off in one of the largest energy producing parts of the world, um, they put it off because they knew that they'd be safe. They knew that they have friends in the GOP who would protect them. And even though, and for people who might look this up, even though there has been some movement in the legend is sort of demanding that they weatherize them, there are so many carve outs, and the process is so long, it's functionally toothless, right? It's sort of like a nice suggestion from the state government of Texas, that you that you
Maybe
make
because,
sure.
well, yeah, I think in general, American liberals, uh, either through naivete or through deliberate obfuscation, often, of course, want to avoid talking about the economic system which brings about these
Mhm.
shortages or brings about price rises or brings about inflation. As a kind of example, I saw somebody, I think on the news, actually, it wasn't on Twitter, it was actually on the news, where they
Uh-huh.
were like, I'm willing to pay uh,
Yeah,
uh, more money for petrol to help the
to
Ukrainians. It's like, well,
support
you're not
Ukraine.
paying that money to the Ukrainians, whether you want to help them or not. You're paying that money to an oil company that's extracting more money from you because the oil price has gone up. So,
Well,
I think, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
no, I was just saying, well, Larry Sumner is somebody who's been getting worked up about inflation in this country, said that it's your patriotic duty to pay higher prices at the pump, and like that was one thing. If you don't mind, I think that there's two really important points here that are both national, but also really important here locally. There was that kind of like snide, green, like liberal reaction to people having to pay higher prices at the pump, but you know, I have no patience for that kind of thing. If you're not somebody who's ever had to make those kind of decisions between filling up your car because you have to get to work, and food, or fuck, frankly, if you have to choose, as some people said, between filling up your car or being able to go to Applebee's with your family once a month, right? Like, I don't understand why that's an argument in the first place. That like, oh, you're a working person and your budget's strapped, and it's like ridiculous for you to say, well, this means I can't have like any sense of leisure in the society. That kind of attitude is extremely nasty. And I just wanted to throw this in here too, Gene, because this is something that's very worrying to me about what this electrical grid system meant. Going back to what I was saying about how there's two different rules for rich and poor people in Texas when it comes to abortion, what you're seeing with a lot of people here, rich folks, particularly with Musk's entrance into the state, um, is this push for like decoupling yourself from the grid through solar and having personal battery power in your houses. Now, I don't want to get into a whole solar thing right now, but as a socialist, I want to remind people that like we don't want to have mass privatization and then mass individualization of crucial services, because what is very, very likely to happen, and you're seeing it happen in cities like Austin, these wealthier places, is people are saying like, well, the grid's screwed, so I'm going to make my house function properly, right? Decouple ourselves from the kind of commons, from the general structure. And you know what that's going to do here is we will have a failing electrical system for the rest of us, tax breaks for the rich to decouple themselves so that they can have sustainable and constant power to their homes, while working class and poor people basically have to suffer with high electricity prices, dirty energy, and a failing and faulty grid. Right? This is like a moment where you have to have that kind of solidarity. If rich people can pull out of public utilities like that, it always hurts us, right? It's like the same reason when we talk about public schools, right? Like that is the direction that I see a lot of particularly wealthier folks going. And I understand on an individual level, like you don't want, you want your power to be
No,
on,
of
but
course.
like
Yeah,
you can
no,
see what that means systematically. And particularly in a place like this, where they would be very happy to say, like, yeah, you know what? This is something you're on your own to figure out how to keep the lights on at home.
I think that's a very important point. And I think the point you raised about the snide liberal green ideology is also, I have a very good friend who, a very close friend who made a Facebook post saying like, well, guys, you're going to have to suck it up for the sake of the planet. And I think this is the problem. The environmental crisis the world is facing is a real crisis. There are people who don't want to face that, who think it's fabricated, and that includes elements on the left as well as the right. But I think especially those elements on the left who think this is a bourgeois conspiracy to, force everyone to live a Spartan life, they have an
Mhm.
element of truth in the argument, because the way that the Democrats and the dominant liberal narrative is relating to green issues is that it is an individual issue. It's a issue of consumption, and it has a kind of moral halo around it. Because if you have the opportunity to cycle to work from
Mhm.
home, to afford to put solar panels on your house, to afford to get better insulation in your house, then that is a personal choice that you're making. And you might be critical of, for example, your fellow members of the bourgeoisie who do not want to do that kind of stuff for whatever reason. But when it extends to the question of poor people, it's like, well, like you say, people have to drive to work. It's not an
Mhm.
abstract issue. There is no public transportation. The solution is, you can't take away people's cheap petrol in America
Mhm.
and then be like, well, you're going to have to learn to cope with it. There's no infrastructure designed for poor people to be able to get to work, to get their
Mhm.
children to work, and all these other issues. In addition, inflation hits poor people who are buying cheap products disproportionately because as transportation costs rise, the proportion of price increases on cheaper products is higher because
Mhm.
50p on top of your fancy coffee is not the same as 50p on 50 cents macaronis, right? So
Mhm.
you have this situation. So I think that's really important. I think you touch on that's a really important sort of failing of the Democratic Party and of liberals in general is they fight these wars which it's the right fight, but they use a very
Mhm.
kind of toxic and snide way of looking at it. And same with abortion. Instead of looking at abortion as a healthcare issue, it's about choice. So it becomes like this, choice is this liberal watchword that everybody has to talk about, rather than looking at as a question of just general healthcare.
Mhm. No, I mean, 100%. And I mean, like the public transportation aspect of that is so critical. I mean, you know, and the sad thing is this is not unique to this area. This is everywhere. But like, I mean, Lord, if you're somebody who works in Austin, in the downtown area, you can't get a house or anything in there unless you have somewhere near $1 million in your bank account. Like literally, even if you could get approved for a loan, the market is so hot here right now that you have to show up with cash in a bag basically the day a listing goes up to be able to afford a home. So what does that mean? People are moving to Buda, people are moving to Georgetown, people are moving to Lockhart, Elgin. That means 45, 50-minute commutes to come and work a job here. And to sit here and say like ride your bicycle is completely out of touch. Now, there are people who have those options, maybe if you live in East Austin or other parts of town. And I think that's a really great thing. I mean, I support, the increase of like, bicycle infrastructure in the city. There's some decent parts of Austin where you can do that. There's some parts of it that it's absolutely frightening to ride your bicycle on the side of the road where people are going 60 miles an hour. But the point is that, you need to understand that the rich and the ruling class want to like, there's this big line on the left for a while that was something along the lines of like there is no neoliberal solution to climate change, and frankly I think that that's wrong. There is one, and this is the one that we're actually staring at right now, which is austerity for the rest of us, higher costs for the rest of us, and opt-out options for the super rich. And if you're serious about dealing with climate change, you need to take that threat seriously. Another aspect here that's really important is dealing with just transition for oil and gas workers, right? Because that's still a major industry here. And when the COVID crisis hit, the price of gas fell dramatically. What happened? It was a sneak peek of what the future will look like. Massive cuts in jobs for people who work in that industry, who do like the actual labor, the difficult labor of refining, storing, and pumping oil out of the ground. Those people were let go, while the people who work in the nice offices in Houston and Dallas were nice. They were fine. They worked from home and hung out with their kids and stuff. Well, other people suffered, right? And if you can't see that on the left as a huge opportunity to get people on your side, right? That we can say, look what is coming for us if we don't demand and make sure that you have a guaranteed, standard of living given to you as we transition into more, green technology and green ways of providing energy for our society, right? You're missing probably a world historic opportunity to actually prevent the worst catastrophe of climate change.
So why are the Democrats such, not that they could necessarily solve any of these issues, but why are they just so bad in Texas at power, at trying
Yeah.
to obtain power? Because one would think that they would want to get power. What is the problem? Is it their ideology? Is obviously their ideology, does it put them at a particular disadvantage in the battle for power in Texas? How and why are they failing, especially since a lot of the talk about demographics of destiny
Mm.
is relating to Texas and the growing minority population in Texas, which apparently we're told are destined to vote for the Democratic Party. So what's the crack?
Yeah, I mean, that's the last bit is the big one, and we'll get to that in a second. But just up front, people need to again understand that even though the state government is sort of run a certain way, these city governments like Texas is so gerrymandered that like you have people who are locked Democratic seats, right?
Mhm.
And that that creates a kind of encouragement for I don't know mediocrity. Like you want to maintain your position in the ledge. You want to maintain good relationships with the National Democratic Party that has very very little interest actually I think in tackling a lot of these fundamental issues that they care about. Just earlier this week Nancy Pelosi showed up here in Austin. And there's a very exciting race in South Texas, a district that goes all the way from the border up to San Antonio. It's one of those insane Texas districts where it's like a little, you could walk across it at some points. But
Right.
it's a race between a progressive Jessica Cisneros, who supports Green New Deal, Medicare for all, the right to abortion, is a good progressive, versus Henry Cuellar, who is one of the most reactionary blue dog Democrats in Congress.
Right.
Somebody who's actually anti-abortion, somebody who's pro-oil, somebody, and I always get really ticked off when you hear national pundits talk about these kind of conservative Democrats being like more in touch with their
Mhm.
constituents. Henry Cuellar just had his house raided by the FBI because he looks like he has been having extremely corrupt dealings with the government of Azerbaijan. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm all for internationalism, but I can't tell you something that is as far away from like the actual lives of working people in that district than having oil dealings with the government of Azerbaijan, right? Nancy Pelosi helicopters into Texas to tell everybody to vote for Henry Cuellar, all while complaining about the GOP assault on women's rights, all while complaining about the GOP love for the oil and gas industry, right? You see that that's the game that they play here. Um, and there's a kind of encouragement for this kind of conservative Democratic politician. So you have that kind of push from the national party, and then domestically, and Mike Davis, I think, wrote the best, analysis of the 2020 election and what Bidenism sort of represented as like an electoral coalition. And you saw where Biden and the Democratic Party started to focus here. It wasn't in the working class communities that have been sort of forgotten and ignored by both the Democratic and the GOP, trying to turn the state from a low voter turnout state to a high voter turnout state. It was wealthy suburbs outside of Austin, Dallas, and Houston that they were targeting. And you can see that in the kind of rhetoric that you get from the state Democratic Party here. It's a lot of freak out about guns. It's a lot of kind of moral hand wringing about how reactionary the GOP is, but yet, as I was just saying, when it comes to Pelosi, not really enough to,
No,
kick
let,
out an
let me
incumbent.
let me give you an example of this.
Yeah.
A Somebody who I know in Springfield, a longtime Democratic Party operative,
Hmm.
big Hillary person in 2016, always critical of Sanders, and we can be critical of Sanders.
Hmm.
But the interesting part was she was Sanders complaining that Sanders is soft on abortion rights when Hillary Clinton literally ran with
Hmm.
Tim Kaine,
Yeah.
who was very squishy on the abortion issue. The utter cynicism of these people, is really striking. It's really the bold face cynicism, because the way I feel, and maybe I'm being
Hmm.
like, I see the Democratic Party in a place like Missouri, in a place like Texas, as basically a club for retiree boomers, like boomer guys, women who were, older women
Hmm.
who were perhaps like hippies in the 60s. And these type of people have like a stranglehold on this political organization.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt about it. And like in Texas too, because people also need to remember this is like one of the most wealthy. This is a wealthy people in Texas are poor, but there are wealthy people here. This is a very wealthy place, and the Democratic Party, nationally and also certainly on the state level, very, very much relies on donors from these kind of wealthy communities, particularly in cities like Austin, where people think like, oh, well, I don't have the ability to, I don't have the ability to basically to influence my elections here because it's basically, the Democratic Party wins here. So they donate incredible amounts of cash to national political figures in the Democratic Party across the country, right? So like Austin in particular is like known as a piggy bank for money raising for the Democratic Party, right? So there is a kind of management of elite issues here with the party, even if it's not on the kind of the side of like the legislature, right? There is a kind of, we want to appeal to these people, not even necessarily for their votes, but mainly for their pocketbooks. And Robert O'Rourke, who goes by the name Beto, that was given to him by by somebody who worked at his home, right? This is a rich boy, is a perfect example of that. He's somebody who has who should be, Abbott is extremely unpopular with people and should be somebody who you could win against. And Beto has not been able to inspire much more confidence, except for people who are like diehard Democratic Party uh, believers. And it boggles the mind again, in a state that, people struggle with extremely low wages. People struggle, across the state with healthcare, particularly in rural Texas, where just like the economics of running those kind of hospitals means that more and more people are having to drive hours upon hours to be able to get basic medical care. And then when they get there, they get faced with massive, medical bills, right? The kind of malpractice from the state to not be able to appeal and win there is truly amazing. And to get to this last bit, because I think this is really gets to like the Democratic Party's ideology, is this kind of demographics are destiny idea. And that has just been shown to be completely delusional as a political strategy. And I would argue on a moral perspective, rightfully so. Because if you don't
Well,
show up for the people,
it's also racist. I mean, like
yeah, yeah.
it's based on sort of a kind of cultural essentialism, which does not take into account the complexities of many of these communities and treats them as a monolith. Shouting white supremacy all day long is not going to win you an election.
Well, also
And
if you're not showing
frankly,
up for people.
you're not showing up for people. And I mean, I think a lot of the problem, and we talk about this a lot on This Is Revolution, is that you have these intermediary classes, people who have
Yeah.
nice jobs, who basically spend all their time writing about how persecuted they feel, rather and basically pimping the trauma of the poor and working class from their own communities, who are disproportionately brutalized by the economic and political system. And I think those elements are quite powerful in the Democratic Party and are very useful allies
So,
to the existing establishment. But I do want to get onto something as we're running lowish on time.
can I just say
I
something
want
really
to,
quick because it's
yeah, go
important?
ahead.
Um,
Yeah.
just because like South Texas is an example of this that's really, really damaging. So Donald Trump picked up a lot of votes in South Texas in the 2020 election. Um, and how could that be? I mean, the guy is frankly, was an open racist, was, attacking the, Hispanic communities across the country. Now, it needs to be noted that it wasn't like a flip. They still went for Biden, but Trump was able to eat into those margins significantly. And there has been a pretty significant resurgence of GOP politics in Tejano communities in South Texas. And it just goes to show the kind of essentialist narrative that like the Democratic Party treats those communities with. They don't show up. People, activists in South Texas were warning the state party that something is happening here. People are going to vote, are trending a different direction. You need to send somebody here. You need to do campaign stops. You need to invest in, traditional electoral campaigns here. There was a refusal because from the Democratic Party, because they're like, these people are are people, right? They're people of color, so they're automatically going to vote Democratic. And it just goes to this kind of essentialist notion that why, and especially in Texas, especially in those parts of Texas where people like live side by side, Why do you think that people who are exposed to the same culture, are part of the same communities, are
Many of
part of the
them are
same
military
media,
veterans. Many of
work in
them
the
come
same
from.
industries? Why do you think that they are just not necessarily going to trend in similar directions to for example, their white neighbors, right? It just boggles the mind. And the answer here, just so nobody misunderstands me, is not that like the left needs to trend and do some kind of socially reactionary mixed with like economic left populism. There is that you need to use the class-based politics that are able to unite people across those different factors to win there and show up, like literally just show up. And there's a refusal and a kind of taken for granted attitude that you're getting from the state Democratic Party that I haven't seen very much evidence is shifting, and it's quite frightening.
Okay, let's get on here to the issue of the left.
Hmm.
So a lot of people, I think, in metropolitan centers, uh, let's say in places like Brooklyn, where you used to live, or in Boston, or the inverted commas coastal cities, write off places like the Midwest as a place where you can do left wing activism. So I kind of have a two-part question. What is the state of the left in a place like Texas today? How is it organizing? And
Hmm.
secondly, and this is a problem that afflicts the left all over the country, to what extent does all that organizing that does take place, if it does take place at all in Texas, to what extent does that merely funnel back into a failing Democratic Party?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on here, and I think particularly over the past 5 years post Bernie, when people saw how successful that kind of politics could be, I think that there's been a revitalization of people who want to return to, class and economic issues that touch upon all of the other kind of traditional, like that touch upon abortion rights, that touch upon environmentalism, but understanding that like we're not going to be able to tackle these things until we build a class-based, working class-based coalition. So there's a lot of effort right now that I think is growing, and hopefully it can grow more to do some serious organizing within oil and gas unions here to take seriously, the concept of a just transition. The Texas AFL-CIO um, actually passed a. They didn't call it, and this is an interesting strategy thing, but they didn't call it a Green New Deal provision, but they supported a federal like environmental policy that was the Bernie Sanders Green New Deal, right? They had to drop the name to win because people had been so inoculated against it because of AOC and those kind of characters. But the meat and potatoes of it, right? Just transition to green energy, were supported by Texas AFL-CIO. And, you have to remember that this is Texas, and that means oil and gas workers, people who are very involved in that industry, right? So there's been a lot of promising labor organizing going on here. There certainly has been tremendous work and brave work when it comes to the fight for abortion in the state of Texas, and I think it's just really worthwhile to just recognize that the people who are continuing to do that work, face the most severe penalties. So there's been a lot of mobilization there. But on the electoral side, um, there has been a lot of great success, and it's been up and down across the major Austin DSA chapters and Texas DSA chapters. And I must say that they're not always the splashiest like online. And it was actually one thing that would frustrate me a lot that people would ignore when they were um, in like New York and other parts of the left, when people in Texas against like significant odds were winning, were winning a lot. For example, after the George Floyd, murder, Austin was able to pass a significant reduction in the police budget here. Um, Austin DSA has elected. We had a city council member, Greg Kassar, who was somebody who came out of labor organizing, who became, firebrand on the city council, fighting for an affordable Austin, really challenging, because this city just gives out shitloads of money to rich tech guys now, fighting against that movement. And now he is running for Congress and won in a landslide his Democratic primary. And because it's pretty solidly blue state, is very likely to be joining the squad, right? And I would argue that he probably is one of the most positive, like working class candidates. That is not without controversy. He's a DSA member, but the DSA had to unendorse him um, over over Palestine, which I think is a really unfortunate thing, and I understand that decision. But just understanding that, like, that movement has been able to develop candidates of that kind of national caliber, I think is very exciting.
But
And
isn't that just being diverted into isn't that just diverting energy into the Democratic Party? Because the DSA can't discipline people. They can't, uh, you could have people in the Congress, even people within the
Mhm.
Democratic Party, but if you get them elected and can't discipline them, uh, isn't the tendency that they will increasingly become distant from your position as
I,
they're assimilated into the power structures, even if they're better
Yeah, no, no,
than
no, no,
the.
Gene,
Mhm.
I 100% agree with that, which is why Austin had to let him go as a member, because there is a understanding that if we are going to play this kind of devil's dance with getting ballot access here by running on Democratic Party ticket, we can't just send people off into these positions, because as we've seen time and time again, as the DSA and these kind of left organizations grow here, you have to be able to play you have to be able to play a very difficult game, in my opinion, which is we need to have party discipline, and we need to have a membership too that are the people who are the first to have their phone call picked up. When it comes to Bowman, when he made his bad votes on Palestine, he was getting 1,000 calls, about supporting the Iron Dome and all that kind of stuff, and he wasn't getting communication from the organization or from his constituents, right? And that's a problem. And I think what you're seeing right now within the organization, it's not settled. Like, as we're talking right now, this is an open fight within the organization of DSA. But as a good Marxist, I'm seeing that these tensions within the organizations are in conflict.
And
And
do you think there's a tension as well between uh, the posture
mm,
of DSA in a place like Texas and the way that the direction DSA is going in some of the big metropolitan centers, especially on the East Coast? I'm thinking, for example, of the fact that I think it was DSA Baltimore
mhm,
had a vote. I don't know if they implemented on having a racial quota of voting and these kind of the infiltration of race first
mhm,
um, liberal politics, the hegemony
yeah.
of race first liberal politics over the left, because I think that's one of the problems we have on the left is that liberal culture is so dominant in many ways that a lot of these issues end up getting assimilated into the left. And we, as leftists, however you want to define it, have a difficult time striking out an independent position without without either getting assimilated into rad lib leftism
Mhm.
or just becoming straight up social reactionaries who just, go mad at any mention of LGBTQ rights or abortion as being just culture wars and idpol. So we end up with this, and I've said this before, we have a really difficult task in fighting a two-front war against
Mhm.
both liberalism and social and conservatism. Uh, and we don't always do the best job because the majority end up getting sucked into Democratic Party politics, and then the minority end up just becoming straight up reactionaries and functional Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, I will not be able to sit here and say that that's not something that exists across the Texas left, and I can only speak, from some experiences that I've had. But I will say that I think, compared to some of the other chapters of DSA, from what I've seen, the only real antidote to that kind of stuff is community work and getting out there and like talking to people and being present, right? Like, when DSA is a kind of internal thing where there's like struggles happening within the membership with one another, and how we want to hold our meetings, kind of stuff like that. It very quickly, I've seen it devolve into that kind of stuff. While, because there are so many direct threats to people here, there has been such a commitment to not just running candidates, but to running social campaigns. So there's like a lot of ballot initiatives, right? And that's not attached to a party, which has meant that people are going out there and they're talking to their neighbors and starting to build a kind of presence and awareness of, like, okay, well, not only is this, a force in the city, but this is a group that can start to get things done. I think that at least in my opinion, is probably the best hope for trying to sharpen the blade of winning politics than any kind of internal arguments that you can be having over these things, because very, very quickly you realize how some of that kind of more performative stuff is ridiculous and it's not very attractive. So I'm not going to sit here and say that it's absolutely perfect, but because there's been such a commitment across these chapters, particularly in the major city areas in Texas, that there's such a need to just like get serious and like actually just like do work instead of debating kind of theoretical things, that I think that sort of shakes off a lot of the weird tendencies that we have developed on the left. But again, it's not perfect, but I think that that's probably one of the more encouraging things that I've seen here.
So, would you posture yourself as someone who is hopeful about the future and about the possible revival of a strong populist left, labor populist left um, tradition in a place like Texas? I mean, how would you fit yourself in, let's say, and I guess we don't have too much time to discuss it in
Mhm.
detail, but within the broader sort of history of the left in a place like Texas? Because I think one of the important things, and I understood this when I moved to Missouri, is that, you know, yeah, there's not like tons and tons of, let's say, out and out like Leninist revolutionaries in the history of the Midwest, but there was a significant left wing orientated
Mhm.
movement or movements that have taken place in the Midwest, and that history has been deliberately obfuscated
Yes.
in the last 30 to 40 years. That history of radicalism that you see in manifest in country music, for example, you see manifest in uh, folklore in places like the Midwest. Is there any kind of organic connection, for example,
Oh,
between
I mean,
this new movement and what came before?
I think going back to like what the GOP is trying to do right now is they're waging war, not on our present but also our history. They're working to make sure that our history is not told in schools in Texas, and I think that that's something that's really important that we push back against, and also reclaim histories that have been purposefully denied to us. So let me just give you one example, like, because Texas is probably one of the least known but more radical states when it comes to working class history here. Um, I love Texas history, so I go and I'm on like the forums and things like that. And I saw a post one day celebrating the Texas Rangers, and they noted a very interesting piece of history called the Fence Cutting Wars. Um, sorry, something just. I'm sorry, Gene.
No
Um,
problem.
are you hearing that?
I can hear you. No, I'm not. You sound perfectly perfect to me.
I'm so sorry. I'm having a issue here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I have no idea. Sorry, my headphones just started blaring like the most poppy music. Oh my god, what the fuck is this? I'm sorry, Gene.
Oh, no problem. There we go.
What is this?
Mystery music.
It's like Bob Dylan. Just I'm sorry, Gene.
The beat
I
they
guess I can
came.
retake that. um, There's a really interesting history here of left wing working class movements and history. I was on one of these kind of Texas history forums because I'm very interested in these things. I love to go to all these old towns, and it was some old timer bragging or just like celebrating this photograph of the Texas Rangers, and in the picture the Texas Rangers were celebrating their victory in the Texas fence cutting wars, and he was like, "This is the day when law and order came to Texas." Um, and it's one of those things that's very funny because a lot of people here aren't aware of their history, particularly people who are, 5, 6, 7 generation Texan. Um, you were far more likely to be somebody who was being shot at during the Texas fence cutting wars than you were to be a Texas Ranger or
Right.
related to them, right? The history here is interesting. So all these small farmers in Texas, they own their land, but after the Civil War, there were all these financial crises, and like Northern capital and British capital primarily came in, and they swept up a lot of these a lot of these small farms, and they turned them from farm owners into tenant farmers.
Mm,
Um, and as all this is going on, there's the invention of what is called the devil's rope, barbed wire. And these kind of very wealthy landowners that were also coming in from primarily Britain, but also a lot of kind of people who are funded by New York, um, were coming in and buying tremendous amounts of land across the state of Texas. And they were putting up these barbed wire fences that prevented people from having the freedom to roam, and most importantly, economically, the freedom to move cattle around the state. They were covering up public roads, again, against the law. But who's going to answer to it? So people took it into their own hands, and they started at first just cutting down barbed wire when it was in their way, and then it became a vigilante thing, where entire gangs of working class people got together, and wherever they saw barbed wire fences, they start cutting them down. So then eventually, the rich landowners started to hire their own thugs. So the vigilantes would have guns, and then thugs would show up on behalf of the rich landowners with guns, and they would start shooting, shooting wars. And it was significant and bloody across the state of Texas. But it was an anti-property movement. People found it ridiculous that you could shut down, the free land, the land that they had known their whole lives as free land for the people, for the free grazing of cattle, and for riding and all these other kinds of things. And it eventually takes the state government sending in the Texas Rangers to completely quell and murder and hang a bunch of the leaders of that movement. And that's an interesting history in and of itself, but it connects to then what happens after that. People started to realize that their problem in this society was not any of the kind of lies that they were being, taught about, race and all this other kind of stuff. It was rich people. And you had this mass movement that started out as the Farmers Alliance, which then became the People's Party. And Texas was the hotbed of that kind of agrarian revolution that then started to create connections with people in the cities. And what was unique about that relationship was that they recognized, obviously, there's a lot of particular things that they were upset about that relate to farming, but one of the big issues that they were focused on was finance capital, because the way that the economic system was set up then, basically, because we didn't have because we were in a deflationary period. If you held debt at the beginning of the season, your debt was in real terms more expensive when you're trying to pay it off at the end of the year.
mhm.
So they started to realize that finance was the problem. They got together and they ended up winning elections across the state on People's Party tickets. Very, very radical. And this is obviously connected to the agrarian revolution that's going on all across the country at this time. What's notable about Texas here is that it was Texas and Louisiana were the two hotbeds of dissent about joining the People's Party in with the Democratic Party. They voted against it, and a few of them ended up breaking completely from it once it started becoming incorporated with the Democratic Party, and started to join and create the early formations of what then became the Socialist Party of America. Right. And you had elected officials from time to time winning across the state. And beyond that, a generation had a kind of anti-capital, pro-people, pro-freedom of movement, anti-property mentality that dominated Texas politics from the early 1900s all the way up to the New Deal. The New Deal, as people know, becomes an interesting moment where like some of those goals start to get realized, some of the things that people want to start to get realized, but it came at the cost of defanging that kind of radical movement. And again, this is like not far off history, and you still see it. There's plenty of people who sort of paint themselves in that kind of history, but it's not as dominant as it should be, and it's just something that is a part of our history and our culture here. And as the GOP is trying to create this kind of fantastical narrative of like what it is to be a Texan, what the Texas Revolution meant, all these kind of things, I think the left really should, and I think there are some people within the movement who are doing it, but we need to get a much bigger audience for this. Be able to tell these stories that, like, if you want to say that you're generation Texan and you're worried about the direction that things are going in, you need to return to your roots, and be an anti-capitalist, anti-property, anti-police, activist, because those are your people, not these kind of rich assholes. Because Texas has always had influx of rich people trying to take shit away from folks who built it here. And that's the kind of radical tradition that I think we can really root ourselves in. And there's a hell of a lot more stories. I know we only have so much time, but it's rich.
Well, I do hope that you will be able to come back and talk to us about some of those exciting stories about the radical tradition in Texas and in the Midwest, and revive a kind of knowledge of the historical past of uh, an indigenous revolutionary tradition in the United States. And I think there is a value to that. I mean, Harvey K talks a lot
Mhm.
about, um, let's say, talks about the New Deal. I think his focus on the New Deal is misguided as a focus for a radical American history. But I think the impulse to highlight indigenous forms of
Mhm.
radicalism in the United States is a legitimate and important one, especially as we live in an age of identity politics and cultural essentialism, in which not only minority groups are painted in a particular light, but also different groups of white people across the United States are portrayed as
Mhm.
monoliths and as unified cultural groups, when in fact they're quite different. They're quite different from one another, and class uh, differences have always been a major factor in American society. So I want to thank you, David. Thank you so much for coming on Sublation Media.
Of course, man.
And I hope we'll have you back soon where we can talk more about this.
Yeah, I would love to.
And we are out.